The day my life changed forever, part 1. The day everything fell apart, I never thought a single text could fracture an entire life. But that morning in Asheville, it did. The city lay beneath the fog, streets glistening with the after-rain sheen, the scent of wet stone and coffee hanging in the air. I was seated at my small desk, sipping my lukewarm coffee, scrolling through emails, when my phone buzzed. It was her. "Emma, can we talk tonight?" 4 words. No punctuation, no emoji. Yet it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. I typed back automatically. "Sure. Everything okay?" No reply. I tried to push the unease aside, telling myself I was imagining things. We had been together for nearly 5 years. "Can we talk?" could mean anything. A discussion about bills, a plan for the weekend. But something felt wrong, a silent tremor under the surface of the ordinary. I walked downtown, camera in hand, attempting to capture Asheville's post-rain calm. I photographed the reflections of neon signs and puddles, the way the sun broke through clouds along the Blue ridges. But the images felt hollow. The city was beautiful, yet it no longer belonged to me. Returning home, I sat on the edge of our shared couch, staring at my phone. Hours passed. No message. No explanation. Only silence. By evening, I went to her apartment. I remember walking up the steps, the rain starting again in soft drizzles. I knocked. She opened the door almost immediately. "Hey," she said. Her voice was soft, subdued, almost fragile. Her eyes betrayed exhaustion, as though sleep had evaded her for nights. Behind her, the apartment looked meticulous, unnaturally clean. "What's going on?" I asked. She sat on the couch, hands folded, staring at the coffee table. "I made a mistake," she whispered. I didn't respond. The words hovered, heavy in the air. She began recounting the details. A lapse, a one-time encounter, her guilt. I barely registered them. My mind couldn't parse betrayal. All I felt was a hollow swell in my chest, a rupture I couldn't repair. "Please say something," she implored. "There's nothing to say," I muttered, standing abruptly. I walked out, leaving her behind, leaving a part of myself behind too. Outside, the drizzle soaked my jacket. The streets reflected the city lights like fractured glass. I walked aimlessly, past familiar cafes and bookstores, past places that had once been ours. Everything was familiar yet alien. That night, sleep refused me. I lay on the couch, replaying memories, every laugh, every touch, every small moment that now felt like deception. Love lingered, stubborn and ghostly, refusing to leave even as betrayal marked the landscape of my heart. By dawn, I understood the cruel truth. Love doesn't vanish in the moment it is betrayed. It lingers, like smoke after a fire. I watched the morning light spill across the floor, the city awakening below. The rain had stopped, but the silence remained. And within that silence, I realized the journey of healing had already begun. The days that followed were a blur, as if Asheville itself had shifted into a different rhythm, one that moved slower than the rest of the world. I woke each morning with a tightness in my chest that refused to loosen, the shadows of betrayal stretching across my apartment. I went through the motions: coffee, shower, checking my emails, editing photos for clients. Everything felt mechanical, hollow. I avoided her calls. I avoided our mutual friends. Every small reminder of her life, once comforting, now struck like a bell tolling grief. Even the photographs we had taken together, us smiling on mountaintops, at the Saturday market, in cafes, became evidence of something irretrievably broken. I found myself walking through the streets at odd hours, as if moving could erase the past. I photographed empty benches, rain-soaked sidewalks, the way fog clung to the mountains. The images were stunning, but every frame carried an undertone of grief. Asheville's beauty mocked me, reminding me that life could go on even when mine felt frozen. I started journaling, trying to contain the tumultuous thoughts that pressed against my mind. On paper, the sentences spilled like blood, raw and unfiltered. I wrote about the betrayal, the heartbreak, the exhaustion of living in a space that no longer felt like home. Some nights, I would fall asleep with the journal on my chest, the pen still damp with ink. Occasionally, I would receive small messages from her, not apologies, not attempts at reconciliation, just brief admissions. I'm sorry, I can't undo what I've done. They were like splinters in my brain, reminders that her existence still touched mine even when she was physically absent. Weeks passed. I began noticing subtle shifts in myself. I walked longer, photographed differently, noticing details I had never seen before. The curve of a railing, the way light refracted through glass, the quiet sway of tree branches in the wind. Pain had opened a door to a perception of the world I had ignored when love had seemed eternal. One afternoon, I ventured to the cliffs overlooking the ocean, a place we had never gone together. The fog rolled in, hugging the rocks below, and I watched the water crash with an indifferent rhythm. Standing there, I realized I was no longer seeking answers from her. I was seeking them within myself. A few brief messages came after that, more admissions of guilt, but I no longer felt the urgent need to respond. I was learning patience, and more importantly, the value of distance. By the end of the month, I had begun reconnecting with myself. I cooked my own meals, rearranged my apartment, allowed sunlight to illuminate corners that had felt permanently dark. The pain was still there, lurking, but it was no longer suffocating. And in quiet moments, I caught glimpses of hope. I noticed the pattern of my own breathing, the steady rhythm of my heart. I noticed that even after devastation, I was still here, still capable of noticing beauty, still capable of living. As the weeks blended into months, I realized that the initial shock of betrayal had softened into a dull ache. Constant, persistent, but no longer immobilizing. I began to fill my days intentionally. Longer walks, more photography, writing in my journal every night. Each action was deliberate, a small reclaiming of myself from the wreckage of the past. I visited our favorite coffee shop one morning. The smell of freshly ground beans and warm pastries filled the air. I sat at a corner table, observing strangers, the rhythm of ordinary life moving around me. People laughed, argued, shared intimate moments. For the first time in months, I felt a quiet thrill, not for her, not for our past, but for the world continuing, indifferent and beautiful. Occasionally, I would think of her, Emma, not with anger, not with longing, but with a bittersweet understanding. I remembered the way she laughed, the tilt of her head, the way she brushed her hair from her eyes. Those memories no longer burned. They lingered like faded photographs, delicate and fragile, yet intact. One evening, I walked by her apartment. The door was closed, curtains drawn. I did not knock. I did not send a message. Instead, I sat on the steps outside, watching the shadows lengthen across the street. I understood then that closure was not something she could give me, nor I her. Closure was an internal process, a quiet settling of the mind and heart. It was during these months that I started to notice subtle changes in myself. I spoke less out of habit and more with intention. I listened, really listened, to people without waiting to respond. I discovered that solitude, once feared, was a companion, a teacher. And in that solitude, I began to see the remnants of hope, fragile and tentative, like morning light through fog. By the time the first anniversary of that fateful morning approached, I had made peace with what had happened. I was not healed entirely, for some scars remained permanent, but I had learned that healing is not a destination. It is a path walked with patience and courage. I looked out at Asheville's skyline one evening, the city lights reflecting softly on rain-slicked streets. Somewhere in the distance, I imagined her walking her own path, just as I was walking mine. And in that thought, there was neither bitterness nor longing, only a profound sense of acceptance. I had survived the day everything fell apart, and somehow, in surviving it, I had discovered myself. As the weeks blended into months, I realized that the initial shock of betrayal had softened into a dull ache. Constant, persistent, but no longer immobilizing. I began to fill my days intentionally. Longer walks, more photography, writing in my journal every night. Each action was deliberate, a small reclaiming of myself from the wreckage of the past. I visited our favorite coffee shop one morning. The smell of freshly ground beans and warm pastries filled the air. I I sat at a corner table, observing strangers, the rhythm of ordinary life moving around me. People laughed, argued, shared intimate moments. For the first time in months, I felt a quiet thrill. Not for her, not for our past, but for the world continuing, indifferent and beautiful. Occasionally, I would think of her, Emma, not with anger, not with longing, but with a bittersweet understanding. I remembered the way she laughed, the tilt of her head, the way she brushed her hair from her eyes. Those memories no longer burned. They lingered like faded photographs, delicate and fragile, yet intact. One evening, I walked by her apartment. The door was closed, curtains drawn. I did not knock. I did not send a message. Instead, I sat on the steps outside, watching the shadows lengthen across the street. I understood then that closure was not something she could give me, nor I her. Closure was an internal process, a quiet settling of the mind and heart. It was during these months that I started to notice subtle changes in myself. I spoke less out of habit and more with intention. I listened, really listened, to people without waiting to respond. I discovered that solitude, once feared, was a companion, a teacher. And in that solitude, I began to see the remnants of hope, fragile and tentative, like morning light through fog. By the time the first anniversary of that fateful morning approached, I had made peace with what had happened. I was not healed entirely, for some scars remained permanent, but I had learned that healing is not a destination. It is a path walked with patience and courage. I looked out at Asheville's skyline one evening, the city lights reflecting softly on rain-slick streets. Somewhere in the distance, I imagined her walking her own path, just as I was walking mine. And in that thought, there was neither bitterness nor longing, only a profound sense of acceptance. I had survived the day everything fell apart, and somehow, in surviving it, I had discovered myself. Days turned into weeks, and the ache began to morph into something quieter, subtler. I kept busy with errands, photography, and walks that led me through parts of Asheville I had never noticed before. The world moved around me, indifferent, and yet I began to feel a small measure of belonging within it again. Occasionally, a text would arrive from her. Short, simple, not demanding attention, not asking for forgiveness. A word, a fragment, thinking of you, or I hope you're okay. I did not always respond, and when I did, it was carefully, devoid of desperation, measured. A strange dance of distance and connection had begun. One rainy afternoon, I found myself near the riverfront, the mist clinging to my jacket, water lapping against the stone embankment. I sat on a bench, watching ducks glide through the currents, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. I wrote in my journal, I am alone, but I am not empty. I am learning to see myself. The realization was gradual. She was a part of my past now, a fragment of my life that had shaped me but no longer dictated my steps. I started visiting local galleries, trying new restaurants, spending time with old friends I had neglected. The process was slow, often tedious, but it was authentic. When we did meet, it was tentative, careful. A brief encounter at the cafe, an exchange of polite words, a laugh that did not carry the weight of nostalgia. I noticed the lines around her eyes, the subtle weariness in her voice. And I realized, as she noticed mine, that we were both survivors of a fractured love, learning to exist alongside the scars it left. I continued my photography, now focusing on details, the curve of a tree branch, the play of light on wet asphalt, the ripple of water disturbed by wind. Each image was a meditation, a small act of reclaiming clarity from the chaos of emotions that had once overwhelmed me. Letters from her arrived sporadically. Sometimes I read them immediately, other times I let them sit on the desk, unopened for days. They were not requests or confessions anymore, only fragments of a person trying to navigate her own path. And I, in turn, was learning to navigate mine. Evenings were the hardest. The quiet, the absence of familiar laughter, the persistent hum of the refrigerator, all reminded me of the void left by love lost. But I began to fill those evenings with intentional solitude. Books, writing, long contemplative walks, quiet reflection. Each night ended with a small sense of accomplishment, a proof that I could exist independently, that life could continue, and even flourish in the absence of her. By the end of the third month, I recognized that the distance between us was not only physical but emotional. And it was a distance that, paradoxically, allowed a new form of closeness, an understanding of self, a respect for boundaries, a capacity to live without dependency. As months passed, the ache that had once dominated every waking thought softened into a quiet companion, a subtle reminder of the love that had once been, now transformed into memory. I began to notice the small joys in my life again. The warmth of sunlight on my skin during morning runs, the smell of coffee from a local cafe, the laughter of strangers echoing through the streets. I started revisiting places we had once gone together, not with nostalgia or longing, but with observation and reflection. The bookstore we frequented, the quiet park bench near the river, the hill overlooking the city, all places that had held love now held lessons. I realized that our past was not erased. It was simply reframed. The letters and occasional messages from her became threads I could observe without being entangled. She was learning her own path, just as I was learning mine. Each interaction, brief and careful, reminded me that reconciliation was not the goal, understanding and acceptance were. One evening, I climbed to the cliffs overlooking the bay. Fog rolled over the water, merging with the sky in indistinct shades of gray. I stood there in silence, letting the wind whip through my hair, and I felt a profound sense of solitude that was no longer lonely. The world existed around me, vast and indifferent, and I existed within it, whole, aware, alive. I wrote in my journal, I am not the same person I was. I have been broken, yes, but I am learning to mend myself in ways I could not have imagined. Pain taught me clarity. Betrayal taught me boundaries. Loss taught me perspective. By the time 6 months had passed, I recognized a subtle shift. I smiled more easily, laughed without restraint, and felt genuine interest in people and experiences outside myself. I began to understand that healing was neither linear nor permanent. It ebbed and flowed like the tides, but each wave carried with it growth. And so, part 2 closes with a quiet triumph. The distance between us, the space of absence, reflection, and self-discovery, had brought me closer to understanding myself, prepared me for the next stage of life where acceptance, peace, and a future unbound by past pain awaited. Part 3, what remains? The years did not rush. Asheville moved in its slow, deliberate rhythm, and I moved with it. Life had regained its color, the edges of grief softened by time and experience. I had learned to enjoy solitude without loneliness, to appreciate my own company without fear, to value memories without being imprisoned by them. Emma remained a presence in the periphery of my mind, a chapter fully written, no longer in progress. We exchanged the occasional message, neutral in tone, a polite acknowledgement of shared history. And it no longer hurt. It never would completely vanish, but the sting had dulled into something manageable, almost educational. I spent mornings walking the Blue Ridge trails, photographing the sun rising over the valleys. The rhythm of my footsteps mirrored the rhythm of my heart, steady and intentional. These walks became rituals, moments of meditation, reminders that life persisted beyond pain. Evenings were reserved for writing, for reflecting, for small acts of self-expression. Words, once a refuge in solitude, became a celebration of survival, a way to mark progress and growth. I wrote about Asheville, about loss, about love, about betrayal, about the quiet triumph of self-discovery. One afternoon, I returned to the cliffs overlooking the ocean, the same ones that had once borne witness to the beginnings of my healing. Fog and mist blurred the line between sea and sky. I watched the waves crash against jagged rocks and realized that life, much like the ocean, moved in cycles of turbulence and calm. I was no longer afraid of the storm. I had learned to navigate it. I noticed subtle changes in myself, a patience I had never possessed, an ability to listen without judgment, a recognition that not all events demanded a response, that some were meant only to teach. I understood the value of boundaries, of measured emotions, of conscious choice in every interaction. And yet, even as life stabilized, I continued to carry the lessons of love and loss. They were not burdens, but guides, maps etched into my memory, reminding me of both fragility and strength. The city itself seemed unchanged, yet I moved through it differently. Cafes that had once been scenes of laughter and love now served as quiet observatories for reflection. I would sit with my camera, notebook, or simply my thoughts, watching life unfold around me, fully aware of my own presence in it. I began to reconnect with people I had neglected. Friends, distant colleagues, even casual acquaintances. Each interaction carried a sense of authenticity, a presence I had lacked when wrapped in the shadow of loss. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I reacted. And in doing so, I noticed subtle joys I had overlooked before. The tilt of a stranger's smile, the rhythm of a street musician's song, the delicate curl of steam rising from a cup of tea. Occasionally, messages from Emma would appear, brief, neutral. A note of acknowledgement. I saw your new work. It's beautiful. Or, I hope your week is going well. I responded with simple politeness, no longing, no anger. We were two people who had once shared love, now existing alongside each other in the shared space of memory, but independent in life. The hardest part was not remembering her, but remembering the version of myself that had existed entirely for another. I had been someone who measured happiness in proximity, someone who placed identity within connection. Through months of distance, reflection, and growth, I had redefined myself. Capable, resilient, and whole, even in solitude. The cliffs overlooking the bay became my sanctuary. I would watch the fog roll in, the waves clash against the rocks, the seagulls wheeling above. Here, I reflected on the passage of time, the persistence of memory, the lessons of love and loss. I realized that true healing was not forgetting, nor erasing the past, but integrating it, allowing it to inform, not dictate, the present. Through photography, writing, and long walks, I chronicled my journey, creating markers of growth. Each image, each journal entry, each quiet step along Asheville's streets became evidence of survival, resilience, and a reclaimed sense of self. The final months of that year brought a quiet, unspoken acceptance. Life moved forward, not with the urgency of new love, not with the intensity of grief, but with a steady rhythm, deliberate and serene. Asheville's streets were familiar now, each corner a testament to the life I had rebuilt. I revisited places once shared with Emma, not to relive the past, but to see them anew. The bookstore, the small cafes, the winding trails, all held echoes of memory, yet the echoes no longer defined me. I was free to observe without being imprisoned by sentiment. Letters and brief messages from her had slowed to near silence. When I saw them, I felt nothing but acknowledgement. Our paths had diverged. We had both grown apart, and that was enough. I had no bitterness, no longing, only a calm recognition of what had been and what remained, the lessons, the memories, and the self I had reclaimed. One late afternoon, I climbed to the cliffs overlooking the ocean. Fog drifted across the water, merging sky and sea in soft gray. The wind tugged at my jacket. The waves below smashed against jagged rocks, indifferent and eternal. I breathed deeply, letting the salt air fill my lungs. I realized then that I was complete, not because I had erased the past, but because I had integrated it. I wrote in my journal, the ink flowing steadily, narrating not loss, but growth. I am whole. I have been broken. I have been betrayed, and I have healed. I am alive. I am learning, and that is enough. As the sun set, casting golden hues across the cliffs, I felt the presence of life itself, persistent, unyielding, beautiful. I walked back through the streets of Asheville with a measured step, each footfall echoing confidence and calm. I was no longer haunted by absence. I was guided by presence, my own, independent, resilient, and aware. The story of betrayal had ended, but the story of self-discovery and living fully continued. And in that quiet, persistent continuation, I found not just survival, but a subtle, enduring peace.